So really there's 5 phases to a disaster recovery and business continuity plan in healthcare specifically, and we're going to go through a few of those. Data security and disaster recovery, there could be a whole course on this material. So we're really getting a snippet. I'm not expecting for you guys to come up with a disaster recovery plan, although that would be kind of cool. But the reality is do you have an understanding of kind of what that happens? Because at some point in time in your career, you're going to be probably faced with a situation where there is a disaster, and you're going to be a part of this plan. So that's why we kind of touch base on it so that you have an idea of what's going on. Again, this is not information that's in the book. One of the reasons we don't have any readings this week is because, quite frankly, I think there's 1 or 2 sentences on cybersecurity or on disaster planning and really very little else in the book. But phase 1, we're going to talk about data collection and technical options. So we're going to collect and review the application portfolio. What do we have in our portfolio of applications and the existing infrastructure and architectures? We're going to review any major application changes and then identify the high availability options to support RTO and RPO. So if we're talking about something that needs high availability, then of course it's going to cost much more money. The recovery point, we're looking at under 5 minutes, and the recovery time to be whole would be less than 24 hours. And when we're looking at the basic recovery service versus continuous availability service, this is definitely a cost thing. So as your need for more on time, more uptime increases, the amount the solution cost is also going to increase. Phase 2, after we've determined the RPOs and RTOs, we estimate the equipment and resource cost. And here's just a table that talks about recovery time objective and recovery point objective. If we're looking for component failure versus facility disaster in under two hours, regional disaster would be under 2 weeks, such as a flood or a hurricane going through. And we're really looking for no loss of any information. Whereas if we go through to our tier 3, which would be like a learning management system, or some of the not as business crucial systems in that tier 3, then it doesn't matter as much how long it takes to recover, just that we do eventually. And of course, during our phase 2 of this, is we're looking at the estimated timeline for implementing these solutions as well as cost, and potentially utilizing the cloud. Now, with the cloud strategy, the backup as a service, and there's lots of companies out there that provide this, is that they're really, depending upon what your needs are providing things that are either a once in a while backup to almost a continuous backup. And really, when we're talking about something like that, it's very expensive to have that best RTO, RPO. But for some tier applications, especially the patient-specific ones, it may be worth the money to do that, to have that high uptime, especially if you're in a situation where you are in Houston, or you're someplace that is highly affected, New Orleans, any place really along the Gulf or along the coasts with hurricanes, tornadoes coming through, Missouri, Kansas. You may want to have some of this higher uptime and higher cost recovery capability. Phase 3, we have to design the infrastructures for redundancy to support those application tiers we just talked about, network services, the file services, protocols, authentication, and more technical services, design storage for the logs of virtualization, what things we're going to store on-site versus off-site, whether we're going to use the cloud, ensure that our current systems support disaster recovery, and if they don't, what do we need to do? Client services, the VPN, antivirus, patching, app distribution. Those are all things that will help with some of the softer disaster recovery in the event of like cyber attacks or what have you. And then the last 2 phases is develop some sort of a disaster recovery plan, which would then dovetail into phase 5, which would be develop a business continuity plan. And of course, those will be something you would test and renew on a annual basis. kind of a lesson learned. It's ironic that a few years ago, this is back in 2010, FEMA actually did have an issue where the equipment failed, and the server just went down, but they were able to save the data. However, they didn't save the software necessary to read the data. So they had all this data. And the funny thing is that the data that was lost, or the access to the data, because the data was still present, it was just the access was lost, included historical data on lessons learned from FEMA's participation in past disasters and best practices. As you may recall, in part 1 of this module, we talked about how we need to make sure that not only is the data preserved, but also the application that reads the data so that you can retrieve it. So they followed up with that incident by implementing a data archiving and recovery mechanism. It had been planning at the time of the disaster and published lessons learned from its own disaster. It's so funny that we can put together as a healthcare organization, or as really stewards of the public health of our constituents' health, that we put together these plans and we decide not to implement them because of budgetary reasons, and then something hits the fan, and we're like, we had the plan in place, all we had to do was execute it, but because of budgetary reasons or whatever reason, we decided not to, and now we're so much worse off because we chose not to. So I would encourage you that if you are in that area, that disaster recovery and cybersecurity are certainly areas that you definitely need to review and look at. Just a reminder, please review this lecture and the assigned articles, review the video. Cybersecurity is really going to be covered in the articles. There's also an articles video. Again, the book is not going to assist us with cybersecurity or disaster recovery, data recovery. It's just not a topic that they cover, but it's something that I think is extremely important, which is why it's been included in this course. Please, as always, feel free to send me an email or shout out on the Learning Management System, and thank you very much again for your time.